Hey there, partner. Tonight, we're taking a little journey, not into the wildest shootouts or lawless brawls, but into something far more grounded and, frankly, a bit more interesting if you're the type who enjoys stories about wallpaper, laundry schedules, and the quiet strategies of women who ran saloons without spilling their tea or their secrets. Now, dim the lights. Maybe fluff that pillow. And if you have a cup of something warm, set it nearby, but not too close. We're heading west. Slowly. Softly. And not too far at first. Imagine, if you will, the year is somewhere around 1883. You're standing at the edge of a sleepy frontier town that hasn't quite decided what it wants to be yet. It's a mix of lumber dust horses and the hopeful scent of fresh bread, though that might just be yesterday's stew, reheated by an optimistic cook. Now, just to your left, past the general store, and a stack of badly painted signs offering authentic gold maps, totally real, you'll find the Double Finch Saloon. Or, as the hand-lettered placard above the swinging doors suggests, Miss Addie Finch's rest stop for gentlemen travelers and unruly dreamers. The building isn't impressive, not in the way city structures are. The porch is crooked. The windows lean slightly inward, as if gossiping to each other. And the swinging doors, well, one swings and one limps. But inside, Miss Addie sits quietly on a stool just beneath a painting of two doves that everyone assumes are finches. She never corrected anyone. She also never corrected the town clerk when he misrecorded her name as Adelaide B. Finch, the B, standing for nothing, but adding just enough gravitas to keep questions at bay. Addie is not young, not old either, just precisely the age where you don't bother explaining things that don't need explaining. Her gray hair is pinned with a fork she found behind the stove one morning in 1879 and decided suited her better than anything with a price tag. Her dress is practical. Her boots are silent. And her smile is always 3 seconds away, though it rarely makes a full appearance. The saloon she runs is not the kind of place that ends in gunfire, although there is a dent in the floorboards where a certain Mr. Haywood dropped his revolver and nearly shot a bottle of blackberry cordial clean off the shelf. She kept the bottle for decoration. It's mostly dust now. Addie didn't start with a saloon. She started with 2 chairs, a tea kettle, and a boarder named Clarence, who paid his rent in stories and exactly 4 cents a week. Over time, the chairs became tables. The tea kettle became a small bar. Clarence eventually moved on, likely toward Oregon, or an equally misunderstood destination. Addie stayed. By the time the town got its second lamp post, the Finch was already a modest success. Not because it served the finest whiskey, although it did serve whiskey. Not because it had a piano, though it had a pianola that worked when the weather wasn't too damp. But because Addie knew everyone's stories and kept them to herself. That more than any beverage was the saloon's most treasured commodity silence. Respectful, intentional, sturdy silence. Of course, the saloon had rooms upstairs, 4 to be precise, 2 with windows, 1 with a creaky bed, and the last one with a wall that leaned just slightly to the east, making it perfect for travelers who liked to feel as if they were sleeping uphill. Addie rented them all, never for less than $3 a week, never for more than $6, and always with the understanding that sheets were changed on Thursdays unless it snowed. She had rules, not posted, not shouted, just understood. No loud arguing, no gambling past midnight, no whistling indoors, and absolutely no throwing things that weren't already broken. The locals abided. Outsiders learned. One man young, loud and certain, the world owed him something through a tin mug during a particularly aggressive rendition of "Oh, Susanna." Addie calmly replaced the mug with a wooden one and made no comment. But the next morning, his pillow had mysteriously vanished, and he slept the rest of his week with a bundled coat and a greater respect for gravity. The women in Addie's employ were not what novels described. They were practical, quiet. Most of them older than 25, which by saloon standards made them seasoned professionals in both conversation and discretion. They wore dark skirts. They braided their hair. And they always knew when to laugh and when not to. Their work wasn't glamorous. It was long hours, lukewarm coffee, and the daily ballet of avoiding both trouble and tuberculosis. Addie provided meals, mostly stew, sometimes biscuits, and on Sundays, an ambitious bread pudding made from stale crusts and quiet hope. She paid her staff promptly, kept a ledger no one but her understood, and once a month she sent a sealed envelope to a church in Kansas City addressed only to M. No one asked, not even the mailman who'd learned in his first week never to question Addie's mail, her meals, or her mild dislike of tulips. And so the Finch endured. Through dust storms, bad harvests, and that time the sheriff married a woman from Pennsylvania who insisted on banning music after supper. She lasted 2 months. Addie didn't survive by accident. She survived by listening, watching, knowing that survival wasn't about noise or guns or loud declarations. It was about staying just quiet enough to hear the town shift ever so slightly beneath your boots. And so, if you ever pass through that forgotten town where the wind speaks in hushes and the signs all lean left look for the Finch, sit down, order the blackberry cordial, she still has the bottle, and ask about the woman with the fork in her hair. She just might nod, but she probably won't smile. Not right away. It was sometime between laundry day and the weekly molasses delivery when Addie Finch found herself faced with a minor crisis, the kind of small, logistical panic that never made it into history books or wanted posters, but mattered all the same to the quiet machinery of a functioning saloon. It began as many such disruptions do, with a shipment of kerosene that never arrived. The lanterns in the Finch weren't for show. Addie insisted on a certain glow dim enough to be forgiving, bright enough to discourage pickpocketing, and soft enough that no one felt the urge to sing too loudly. Without kerosene, the saloon took on a somber hue, and the corners of the room grew a little too generous with shadows. This might not have mattered much in other establishments, where shadows often served as convenient excuses for bad behavior, but Addie's place was a haven of routines, and routines required just the right lighting. So she sent Amos, the 14-year-old, who sometimes swept the floors when he remembered, and other times just shuffled around, looking under tables for nickels to fetch whatever replacement oil he could find. He returned 4 hours later with a tin jug that smelled faintly of turnips and loss. Addie sniffed. It nodded and placed it behind the bar with a label that read, "Bearingly makes the piano wail." She wasn't joking. When lit, the replacement oil produced a flicker so erratic it made the pianola sound like it had developed stage fright. No one complained. Regulars simply adjusted their expectations and their hats and went on drinking watered-down bourbon with the patience of saints who'd misplaced their halos. By now, most of the townsfolk understood that Addie's saloon was less about the drinks and more about the way it held the town together, like an old quilt stitched from mismatched intentions. If you sat long enough, you might catch snippets of everything that passed through the region. Gold rumors, cattle updates, the occasional debate about whether or not Miss Carey from the bakery was secretly married to a traveling magician. Addie knew better, of course. Carey was married to no one but her biscuit recipe, and the only magic she trafficked in was the ability to make sugar disappear during wartime. The saloon, meanwhile, functioned as the town's unofficial archives. Not in any formal sense. There were no filing cabinets, no labeled drawers, no ink-stained registers of local lore, but rather in the way the air seemed to remember things long after the speakers had moved on. The floor creaked in a particular way near the second table, where Mr. Rollins once confessed to embezzling church funds to buy a telescope. The back door stuck slightly ever since Mayor Bixby had tried to sneak out during the Great Pickle Dispute of '81, and the coat hook nearest the stove wobbled gently. Forever unsettled by the night, a dog wandered in, wearing a child's bonnet, and was immediately mistaken for a ghost. Addie, for her part, remembered all these things without trying. She was not a woman of lists or journals. Her memory was housed somewhere deeper in the slow blink of her eyes when someone ordered the wrong drink, or the way her fingers drummed a rhythm no one else could hear when someone lied about their name. It was said she could spot a con man before he opened his mouth, and an honest man just after he shut it. Her instincts were so finely tuned that when a stranger entered the Finch one particularly dry Tuesday afternoon, she didn't look up from her inventory of toothpicks, but she did reach under the bar and tap the bell hidden in the flour tin. This bell, inaudible to the average ear and muffled by layers of cornmeal and nostalgia, summoned Rosie. Rosie was the saloon's unofficial second-in-command, a position she earned not through inheritance or ambition, but through sheer reliability and the calm expression she maintained, even while removing two arguing cowboys with nothing more than a broom and a firm stare. Rosie emerged from the back with her sleeves rolled up and her eyebrows already prepared. The stranger, to his credit, had the decency to remove his hat, though he did so with the awkward grace of someone who wasn't used to entering rooms that smelled faintly of boiled peaches and justice. He asked for tea. Addie poured it. No questions. Just the clink of a spoon and the faint whoosh of someone exhaling in the corner because the piano had remembered its place and resumed playing a lullaby without being asked. The stranger stayed for 23 minutes. He sipped his tea, glanced at the shelves as if expecting secrets to be alphabetized, and then left with a nod so vague it might have been intended for a spider on the windowsill. No one followed. No one asked. And yet, for the rest of the day, the air in the Finch felt half a degree more curious. That night, Addie checked every window latch twice and moved the broom closer to the stairwell, just in case. She didn't believe in omens, but she did believe in patterns, and something about that man's boots had scuffed the floor in a way she hadn't seen since spring of '77. When a traveling preacher tried to convert the saloon by shouting psalms over poker games and was eventually persuaded to take up residence in the abandoned feed store instead. The next morning, Addie rose with the sun, not because she liked mornings, but because the Finch did. The saloon woke slowly, like an old cat, deciding whether or not to stretch, and Addie liked to be there, to catch its first breath. She swept the steps. She watered the plant that may or may not have been a weed, but had earned its place in the window by sheer survival. She wiped the bar, rearranged the chairs, and placed exactly 3 mismatched coasters at precise angles, one for the sheriff, one for Rosie, and one for whoever wandered in looking lost but polite. Outside, the town was beginning to stir. The blacksmith's forge hissed like a tired sigh. A child chased a chicken with the grim focus of someone avoiding chores. The sky hinted at weather, though it hadn't decided which kind. And somewhere beyond the ridge, a telegraph wire trembled, as if it had just remembered something urgent. Addie poured herself a cup of coffee, so weak it could barely sit up, and watched the street with the careful detachment of someone who knew that the truly important things in life, trust timing and kerosene, always arrived late. By the time the clock above the bar nudged its single, stubborn hand toward 11, still 15 minutes, fast just the way Addie liked it, the Finch had resumed its usual weekday rhythm, which is to say it sounded very much like a room exhaling through its floorboards. The poker table remained unoccupied, the piano silent, and Rosie sat near the window, repairing the hem of a curtain that had unraveled not out of malice, but from the sheer weight of time and the occasional drunk brushing past too carelessly. Addie, meanwhile, was occupied with the salt jars. She had 5, all labeled with various degrees of optimism. For eggs, for wounds, for ice, for luck, and the one marked simply, don't. She refilled them every few weeks, regardless of use, because consistency was a kind of comfort that even whiskey couldn't replace. It was in the middle of her careful scooping that the door creaked. Not a visitor. Just the wind deciding to make an appearance through a crack someone had forgotten to seal with old newspaper. The wind didn't bring anything in, but it took just enough warmth out that Addie reached instinctively for the kettle. The stovetop hissed its usual protest, and the saloon sighed back. That's when Amos returned, not from any task in particular, but from the back alley, where he claimed to be sorting empty bottles, though no one had ever confirmed this. He held in his hand a scrap of folded paper, already soft from being opened and closed, with the sort of reverence a 14-year-old might reserve for treasure maps or mildly inappropriate jokes. Telegraph, he announced, placing it on the bar, as though it were too important to hand directly to anyone. Addie wiped her fingers on a cloth that was more suggestion than sanitation, and unfolded the paper with the calm of someone used to messages arriving with poor timing and worse spelling. It was short. 3 lines. The first one addressed to no one. The second, a sentence that didn't seem to understand its own meaning. The third initials that didn't match anything she'd seen in the town registry, the church book, or the ledger she kept beneath the floorboard, under the stove. She read it twice, then once more for good measure, then folded it back into thirds and slid it into her apron pocket. Was it buzzing, she asked. Amos blinked. Buzzing. She meant the telegraph line. Occasionally, when news of no consequence traveled great distances, the wire would hum faintly like a mosquito trying to remember a tune. Did the line buzz before it came? He shrugged, which in Amos speak translated to possibly, I wasn't paying attention. And there was a lizard, and I got distracted. Addie nodded once and made no further comment. Rosie, having finished her curtain, folded it neatly and rose to hang it with 3 thumbtacks and a nail she'd hammered in sideways the year before. Wrong wire, she asked, not turning from the window. Addie didn't answer, not out loud, but she did glance at the kettle as it began to steam, and Rosie took that as confirmation enough. The kettle whistled a little too early, possibly out of nervousness, and Addie silenced it with practiced grace. She poured a cup, added exactly 1 sugar cube, and placed it on the corner of the bar where no one ever sat. Unless they had something to say, they weren't quite ready to say yet. No one claimed it, but the cup remained. Hours passed the way hours do in towns not particularly invested in punctuality. The sun climbed half-heartedly. The street outside shifted from shadows to brightness, and back again. A woman with 2 chickens and a suspiciously clean bonnet walked by 3 times, once in each direction, and once diagonally, though no one could say why. The saloon kept breathing. Chairs creaked. Dust fell. Somewhere outside, a dog barked, as if it had just remembered a grudge. And still, the telegram sat in Addie's pocket, folded and warm, like a small question, refusing to grow larger. By late afternoon, the regulars began to appear, not in a rush, but in the way barn cats appear when they suspect supper is soon. Mr. Peebles, who hadn't spoken above a whisper since 1876, took his usual place by the stove and began carving something out of a block of wood that may have once been intended for furniture. Lottie, whose laugh could peel paint, set down her carpet-bag with a sigh that suggested she'd once again lost at dominoes to her sister-in-law and wasn't ready to forgive it. And finally Mr. Langtall and unnecessarily loud brought with him a breeze, a rumor, and a desire for pickled eggs that no one ever quite understood. Addie served them all, without comment. Her apron pockets now held the telegram, a stub of pencil, 2 folded napkins, and a packet of tea someone had mailed from New Orleans, unasked and unsigned. When Lang asked what was new, she said only dust and draft, and he accepted that as both a truth and a polite way to discourage further inquiry. But Rosie watched her the way Rosie always did, when Addie didn't say what she was thinking. She watched the way her fingers hovered just a second too long over the sugar tin, the way her eyes scanned the mirror behind the bar, not for dirt, but for movement. The way she checked the door twice without seeming to move. And she watched the way Addie finally quietly reached under the bar and slid the telegram out like a card no one had asked to see. "Something odd," Addie murmured, holding it where Rosie could glance without appearing to. Rosie read it once, then again. Then she frowned, not because the message was dangerous or scandalous, but because it wasn't anything at all. It read like a weather report for a storm that had never existed. Just enough detail to sound official, just vague enough to feel wrong. The initials DL meant nothing, and yet the way the letters were written, too sharp, too careful, hinted at someone who hadn't written in a long time, and suddenly had to remember how. Rosie set her tea down with unusual precision. "You want me to ask around?" she said, not because she expected permission, but because she knew Addie would never ask it herself. Addie shook her head. "Not yet," she replied, as if waiting for something more to arrive, something to explain the message, or at least justify the feeling that had settled in her spine like a draft from an unclosed door. Outside, the sun dipped a little lower, the air cooled, but only slightly. And somewhere along the telegraph line, a bird landed, for no reason at all, looked around, and decided not to sing. By sundown, the finch was dressed in its usual coat of soft lamplight and stove warmth, a subtle glow that made everything inside look slightly more forgiving than it was, and everything outside slightly less welcome, which suited Addie just fine. She didn't close the doors early, not officially, but there was an art to encouraging a place to feel less available, and she was a practiced artist in that regard. The piano, sensing the mood, played itself only once a hesitant little tune that sounded more like it was remembering something than performing, and then fell silent, apparently embarrassed. Rosie had gone upstairs to inventory the linen closet, which was less about linens and more about seeing whether anyone had borrowed the good towels and forgotten to return them. Amos was attempting to count the number of coins in the tip jar by shaking it next to his ear and declaring 11 no matter what sound it made. Addie, meanwhile, had finally folded the telegram one last time and placed it into the tin box beneath the bar where she kept other things that didn't quite belong in drawers. One yellow button, a broken watch that still ticked when the weather was humid, and a small flat stone from a river she hadn't seen in nearly 2 decades. She didn't intend to keep the message hidden exactly, but she also didn't intend to bring it out unless something else arrived to justify its presence, which meant, for now, it sat with the other objects suspended in semi-retirement, existing just enough to be remembered, but not so much as to be acted upon. Outside, the wind had shifted direction. Nothing dramatic, just a soft turn in the way the dust moved along the main road, lifting slightly toward the north instead of dragging itself east. Addie noticed it only because the lamp by the front window flickered in response, and she adjusted the wick, not because it was needed, but because it gave her something to do with her hands. That was when the knock came. Not the swing of a door or the stomp of boots, but a knock, 3 short taps, spaced too precisely to be accidental and too polite to be anyone local. Addie didn't freeze, but she did pause, which for her was the same thing. She waited long enough for the room to adjust itself to the sound, then walked to the door and opened it, the width of a conversation, no more. The man standing there was not the same as the one who'd ordered tea. This one was taller, but not imposing. His coat was neat, but dusty. His boots well worn, but recently polished. He carried a bag that looked like it had been packed with equal parts purpose and regret, and he held in his left hand a hat not as a gesture of respect, but as if he'd forgotten to put it back on after deciding whether or not to come inside. Addie looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them blinked for 3 seconds, a respectable pause for strangers in a town where silence was currency. Then he said, "I was told there might be a room." Addie nodded once, because there was. There was always one room kept just slightly more ready than the others, not because anyone had reserved it, but because Addie believed in being ready for arrivals you didn't expect, but couldn't afford to ignore. She opened the door a little wider and gestured. He stepped inside, not with the wariness of someone expecting danger, but with the weariness of someone who had already met it, survived, and didn't care to discuss the terms. The saloon adjusted to his presence with the subtle creak of wood, accepting new weight. No one spoke. Mr. Peebles raised an eyebrow. Lottie frowned into her tea. Amos pretended to be counting bottle caps. The man set his bag down at his feet and waited, hands visible, posture, quiet eyes, that kind of gray you only notice after the weather turns. Addie poured him water without asking, placed it on the bar, with the same motion she used for strangers who might be staying longer than they claimed, and asked, "Name not sharp, not gentle, just enough." "Dale," he replied. No surname, no explanation. Addie let the silence stretch a moment, then handed him a key from the hook marked 3. The room with the good mattress and the bad window latch. As he turned to go upstairs, she said, not loudly, "You're late." He paused, glanced back, and said, "I know," before climbing the stairs with the slow precision of someone who didn't want to wake anything, including the stairs. Rosie reappeared just as he disappeared. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't need to. Addie was already back behind the bar, drying a glass that hadn't been wet in an hour. "He's alone," Rosie asked, her tone carefully neutral. Addie nodded, eyes on the glass. "Seems like telegram related. Doesn't matter yet. But you think it might." Addie didn't answer, but the way she placed the glass upside down and aligned it precisely with the mark on the shelf where it always sat, said enough. Upstairs, floorboards creaked with familiar unfamiliarity. The guest settled in the way people do when they aren't sure how long they're staying, but don't want to unpack completely, just in case. Downstairs, the Finch returned to its rhythms, slow, steady, and suspiciously calm. Outside, the wind blew northward still. A lantern 2 doors down guttered and died. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote barked, once, then went quiet, as if surprised by its own voice. Addie sat finally, and let the night spread around her like a blanket, with too many corners and not enough heat. The fire crackled. The room breathed, and above them, the guest in room 3 opened his bag and removed something that didn't make a sound when it touched the table beside the bed. Something small, something flat, something that had once belonged to someone else, but now sat waiting in the dark. The Finch did not keep a guest book. Not because Addie was against the idea of recorded history, but because she understood the kind of people who stayed in room 3 were not interested in having their names remembered, at least not on paper. They left traces in other ways, a worn patch on the bedpost where someone leaned too often, a scratch on the dresser that might have once spelled a word, or maybe just a hesitation. And sometimes, if the wind hit just right, the scent of pipe smoke long after it had been banned by mutual understanding. That night, the air in room 3 was still the sort of stillness that isn't comforting, but concentrated, like the quiet inside a clock before it ticks. Dale, or the man who said his name was Dale, sat at the small table beside the bed, the one with the slightly uneven leg that made writing a challenge and eating a gentle negotiation. The object he had placed there was round not perfectly so, and covered with a fabric that used to be green, but had since faded into a sort of mossy indecision. It had a zipper barely functioning, and when opened, revealed not money, not weapons, but a stack of yellowed envelopes tied together with a piece of string that looked older than most of the chairs downstairs. He didn't untie them. He just looked at the stack, as if the act of seeing them again might tell him what to do next. Below, the saloon's usual clatter had long since drifted into the softer sounds of closing. Rosie had snuffed the outer lanterns. Amos had been sent home, though it took 3 reminders, and the bribe of half a biscuit. Lottie had left with her usual wave and a comment about dreams involving bears that wore suspenders. Peebles was dozing upright, which was how he always ended his nights, and Addie had begun the quiet ritual of wiping down surfaces that no one had touched, purely to keep her hands in motion. The fireplace burned low. The piano had not played since the new guest arrived. It was perhaps sulking, or simply observing. Addie hadn't gone upstairs. She didn't need to. Room 3 spoke through the floorboards when it wanted attention, and tonight it hadn't said a word. But she could feel it, the shift in weight above her, the faint hesitation in how the guest walked like someone measuring distance with memory rather than steps. Rosie poured herself a final cup of tea, steam curling up like a secret, looking for a listener, and sat on the bench beside the front window. She didn't speak, didn't ask, just sipped and stared through the glass at a night that refused to be fully black, the moon just bright enough to confuse the shadows. "He unpack?" she asked eventually, as if it mattered. "Some," Addie said. "Not all." Quiet one. So far. Rosie considered this, then added, "You gonna ask about the letters?" "Not tonight." "Tomorrow?" Addie didn't answer. Instead, she turned over the bar towel and folded it into quarters, then eighths, then tucked it into the drawer beside the bottle of gin that nobody ever ordered, but everyone liked knowing was there. Upstairs, Dale had finally stretched out on the bed, not under the covers, just on top of them, one boot off the other still on, as if he hadn't decided whether rest was an option. The letters remained on the table. The lamp glowed weakly beside them. He stared at the ceiling for a while, though not the way people do when they're thinking. More like someone watching to see if the ceiling was going to blink. Every so often, he reached into his coat pocket, not pulling anything out, just checking, then returning his hand. It was a habit of people who had something worth worrying about, or at least something they couldn't quite leave alone. The clock downstairs ticked. someone in a nearby house sneezed. The wind toyed with the shutters. Dale eventually sat up, again, sighed a sigh too shallow to carry any message, and returned to the letters. He untied the string slowly, like someone disarming something delicate, and pulled out the first envelope. It was unmarked. Inside a single sheet of paper folded once. He didn't open it. He placed it beside the lamp and took out another. Same story. Again. Again. After the fifth, he stopped, looked at the stack, chose a letter near the bottom, unfolded it, and began to read. The paper crackled. The ink had faded. Whatever was written had been done in a hand that knew how to say too much in too few words. He read once, then again, then folded it back and placed it beneath the others. Then he sat perfectly still, so still that the sound of the room began to press in the hum of silence, louder than any voice. Addie, still downstairs, looked at the stairs like they might speak first. Rosie had gone to bed, her cup washed, and placed precisely upside down in the basin. The lamps were turned down. The fire no longer crackled, but glowed. Addie poured herself the last of the coffee, lukewarm and sharp, and sipped it, as if she hadn't tasted it before. The weight upstairs hadn't shifted in minutes. Room 3, for now, was quiet. But it wasn't resting. And neither, it seemed, was Addie, who reached once more into the drawer below the bar and took out a notebook that hadn't been opened in months. It wasn't a ledger, not exactly, more of a memory aid. She opened to a page. Near the back, thumbed through a few names, some underlined one scratched out with such force the paper had torn, and paused at a set of initials written in faded blue DL. No notes, no address, just the letters. She closed the book, slid it back into the drawer, and stared at the bar top as if it might start whispering. Upstairs, Dale placed the envelopes back in their pouch, retied the string, and returned it to his bag, which he then moved to the floor beneath the bed, precisely centered. Then he turned out the lamp, lay down again, and closed his eyes. He did not sleep. Not yet. Outside, the moon watched without blinking. The finch creaked once softly, and the night, full and patient, waited. Morning at the Finch arrived not with a clamor or clatter, but with the slow exhale of creaky floorboards and the familiar hiss of coffee water just beginning to boil. The saloon always woke up before its guests, stretching gently through the warmth of the hearth's remaining embers, and the barely there rustle of Rosie rearranging the breakfast tins. Addie had already been awake, though anyone watching her quiet movements might think she'd never gone to sleep at all. She had that look about her in the mornings, eyes clear, but heavy, as if they'd been busy holding too much in the night and hadn't quite put it down yet. The key from room 3 was still missing from its hook, which was expected, though. Addie checked it anyway. A small ritual, not unlike a farmer tapping the fence post just to be sure the cows hadn't learned ambition overnight. The coffee was strong intentionally, so because this was not a day for half-hearted flavors. It was the sort of morning where the sun rose a bit uncertainly, as if debating whether it should warm things up or simply observe. And the birds outside sang in hesitant bursts, like someone trying to remember a tune they hadn't needed in months. Addie placed a tray on the bar, not for anyone in particular, at least not officially, but with quiet certainty about who would receive it. On the tray, 1 chipped cup, a folded napkin, 2 slices of toasted bread that had been left too close to the stove for too long, a small dish of butter that looked smugly soft, and a boiled egg Addie had taken particular care not to crack. The spoon, however, was missing. She looked where it should have been in the drawer, beside the flour tin, under the towel stack, even behind the shelf, where Amos sometimes dropped things in a rush to look helpful. No spoon. Not one that matched, anyway. She shrugged. Not annoyed, but mildly curious, and replaced it with a butter knife, polished just enough to look intentional. By then, Rosie had appeared, hair pinned, sleeves rolled, and expression as unreadable as the drawer where Addie kept half the town's secrets. "He still up there?" Rosie asked, not needing to clarify who light was out when I passed. Addie said, as if that answered everything and nothing. "Tray's going up. Eventually. You want me to?" "No?" Addie said too quickly, then softened it. "I'll take it." Rosie nodded once, then moved to the stove to coax the fire into something more than mood lighting. Addie lifted the tray balanced with both hands and made her way up the stairs that creaked not with complaint, but recognition. At the top, the air was different. Still Finch air, but older, somehow more careful. She paused outside room 3, listening. No movement, no cough or shuffle or sound of boots on wood, just the soft, unmistakable quiet of someone being too quiet. She knocked. Once. Twice. Then opened the door with the heel of her palm, gently, as if the latch might change its mind if she were too firm. The room smelled like sleep and old paper. Dale sat on the edge of the bed, boots on bag-zipped posture, so still it could have been mistaken for calm. He looked up, not surprised. "Didn't order breakfast?" he said, though his voice lacked the conviction of someone invested in turning it away. Nobody does, Addie replied, setting the tray down on the dresser beside the crooked lamp. He glanced at the knife, blinked once, then picked up the toast without a word. Addie didn't leave right away. She adjusted the curtain so it hung just a little straighter, wiped an imaginary smudge from the mirror, and studied his reflection without appearing to. He ate slowly, more out of obligation than hunger. You stayed still most of the night, she said, her tone so flat it barely qualified as observation. Didn't sleep. He shrugged, which she took as confirmation. Those letters. Important. Another pause. Another bite. Then finally, they were. Addie nodded, then pointed at the pouch on the bedside table, still within easy reach, its fabric now bearing the faint imprint of his hand. Not were. Still are. Dale didn't respond, but his eyes followed her finger for just a moment longer than necessary. Said you were late, she continued, not pushing, just remembering aloud. That means someone else was early. He put down the toast, wiped his fingers on the napkin without looking at it. Depends who you ask. I'm asking you. Then, yes. And are they coming here? A beat. Probably not. Addie's brow didn't lift, her stance didn't change, but the air around her seemed to shift just slightly, the way warm bread gives beneath a fingertip. You're sure? She asked, though not doubting. He looked up, then properly, for the first time since the tray arrived. Not many people come back here on purpose, he said. That's kind of the point. Addie absorbed that, then picked up the egg, tapped it once against the tray's rim, and peeled a neat crescent of shell before setting it down again untouched. Most people leave things behind when they don't plan to return, she said softly. You brought yours with you. He didn't answer. The boiled egg sat there, perfectly peeled, cooling slowly. Addie reached into her apron pocket, pulled out a small spoon, one that didn't match anything, likely lost from another set long ago, and placed it gently beside the knife. Found it, she said, as if that settled something. He looked at the spoon, then at her, and for the first time smiled, just slightly. Not warmth, recognition. Thanks, he said. You might need it, she replied, and left the room before the silence decided to speak again. Downstairs, Rosie was waiting with her arms crossed and an eyebrow halfway raised. He talking? She asked. Addie placed her empty hands on the counter. Some. Anything useful? We'll see. Still leaving today? He hasn't said. Rosie poured 2 cups of coffee, pushed one across the bar. Feels like a leaving day. Addie sipped. Maybe. Or maybe not. Addie didn't reply because just then the front door opened, Not swung, not shoved, just opened. And a woman walked in wearing travel dust and an expression that suggested she didn't care if breakfast was still being served. She stepped inside like she'd been here before, though Addie knew she hadn't. Not in this town, not in this saloon, not in this year, or the dozen before. There was something about her, not just the coat that looked too warm for the season, or the boots that had been cleaned more often than worn, but the way she looked at things, calm and unblinking, like someone making a map in her head, with no intention of ever sharing it. Rosie, who had just begun her second cup of coffee, froze for only half a second before moving as if she hadn't, her eyes flicking from Addie to the newcomer and back again with the quiet alertness of a person used to tension arriving on two legs and asking for tea. Addie didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. The woman moved to the bar without prompting, not hurried, not tentative, and sat on the third stool from the left, the one with the faint split in the seat that nobody noticed until they did. "Morning," she said, not smiling. Addie returned the greeting with a nod and poured coffee without being asked. She placed the cup down gently, not close, not far, and leaned back just enough to let the silence settle into the spaces between the floorboards. The woman sipped once, then again, and finally looked up. Her eyes were gray, not in the way of storms, but of gravel, steady, unshifting, and slightly worn. "I'm looking for someone," she said, and both Rosie and Addie remained perfectly still, as though movement might change the shape of the words. Tall man, quiet, carries a bag like it's heavier than it should be. Addie took a slow breath through her nose, not giving anything away. "Plenty of folks carry bags," she said evenly. "Most of them heavier than expected." The woman didn't blink. This one would have arrived yesterday. Late. Might have looked like he didn't mean to stop, but did anyway. "That covers more than you think," Addie replied, wiping a dry spot on the counter. "Town's full of detours." The woman's fingers curled lightly around the cup, not tense, just present. He would have had letters. Old ones. From me. At that, Rosie looked up. Addie did not. "Plenty of letters pass through here, too," Addie said more softly now. "But they don't always come with explanations." "He's not dangerous," the woman said too quickly. "He's unfinished." It wasn't the word Addie expected, which is exactly why she believed it. She studied the woman again this time, letting her eyes take in more the curve of her shoulders. Not slumped, but tired, the way her coat didn't quite fit her arms, as if borrowed in a hurry, and the thin line of ink just beneath her left thumbnail. She was someone who wrote more often than she spoke, and regretted both in equal measure. "You, his sister?" Addie asked, not accusing. The woman hesitated. "I was," she said. "Now I'm not sure what we are." Rosie set down her cup finally. "He say he was expecting you." The woman shook her head. "I doubt he expected anyone. That's why I came." "What do you want from him?" Addie asked. "Nothing." She said too quickly again, then corrected herself. "Answers. Or apologies. Or just to know if the letters mattered to someone besides me." Addie didn't speak for a long moment, long enough that the air between them grew warm and uncomfortable, like tea left sitting too long. Then she turned and reached under the bar, pulled out a clean plate, and began arranging toast butter and a single boiled egg. No knife. No spoon. Just the egg sitting there, like a question she hadn't decided how to ask. "He's upstairs," Addie said, at last, placing the plate on the bar in front of the woman. "Still finishing breakfast." The woman didn't touch the food. She looked at it the way someone looks at a gift they didn't ask for, but can't quite return. "I won't bother him," she said. "Not yet." Addie nodded once. "That's up to you." Upstairs, room 3 had not stirred. Dale, or the man who said his name was Dale, had remained seated after Addie left, not eating, not reading, just staring at the pouch on the table as if it might eventually speak. He hadn't heard the door open downstairs, or if he had, he hadn't reacted. He'd been waiting for something. Now it seemed that something had found him. The light in the room had shifted. Morning sun caught the edge of the lamp base, casting an uneven circle across the floor. Dale stood, walked to the window, and looked out, not to see the street, but to see if he felt watched. He did, but not in the way that meant danger. In the way that meant something he'd put down had come back not out of spite, but obligation. He stepped away from the window, picked up the pouch, and untied the string again slower this time. Each letter felt heavier now, not because of what they said, but because of who else had seen them. He pulled one from the middle, the paper folded crisp, the ink still visible, the handwriting unmistakably hers. He read a single line, stopped, folded it again, then tucked the pouch back into the bag, zipped it shut, and placed it on the bed. Downstairs, the woman finished her coffee. The egg remained untouched. Rosie stood crossed to the stove and stirred the pot of whatever might pass for soup by lunchtime. Addie said nothing more. The door to the saloon remained open half an inch, just wide enough to let in light, but not enough for dust. The woman reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small notebook. The cover worn the spine cracked in 2 places. She opened it, tore out a page without reading it, and folded it into a neat square. She placed it under the edge of the plate, beside the egg. Then she stood. "Thank you," she said, though it wasn't clear who she was thanking. She left as quietly as she arrived. Addie waited until the door clicked shut, then reached for the note beneath the plate. She didn't open it. Not yet. Upstairs, Dale sat back down on the edge of the bed, hands resting on his knees, eyes closed. Not asleep. Listening. The finch once again held its breath. Addie didn't open the note right away. She slipped it into her apron pocket next to the stub of pencil that had long since lost its eraser, and the small, flat stone she kept not for luck, but for balance. She moved the untouched egg back to the kitchen tray, wiped down the bar with the towel she used only when she needed to think, and listened to the silence settle again, like dust on a shelf that had never quite been cleared. Rosie had returned to her usual post by the stove, one eye on the soup, the other watching Addie's hands, like they might reveal something her mouth never would. She left fast. Rosie said, not quite asking. She didn't need to stay. Addie replied, not quite answering. She say what the note was. No. You gonna read it? Addie pulled the note from her pocket, held it a moment, then unfolded it with the care usually reserved for brittle leaves or fragile truths. The paper was lined, torn neatly from a small notebook, the top edge still bearing the faint curve of the spiral. The writing was precise, each letter upright and evenly spaced, as if the words had been trained to behave. There were only a few sentences, written without flourish. If he reads the 5th letter, he'll understand. If he doesn't, that's his choice. I just needed to know if he carried them for the right reason. I'm done needing answers, but I still hope for them. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. Addie folded it again, this time more tightly, and slipped it beneath the bar, tucking it between 2 loose floorboards where it wouldn't be found unless someone knew exactly what to feel for. Upstairs, Dale had not moved. His fingers tapped lightly on his knee, a rhythm he hadn't intended, not quite a song, more like a question repeating itself. He hadn't opened the pouch again. He knew what the 5th letter said. He didn't need to reread it, but he did need to decide if carrying it had meant something, or if he had just been too stubborn to let it go. There was a knock at the door, one short tap. No urgency. Dale looked up. It's open, he said, not loudly. Addie stepped inside. Tray in hand. This time, it held only a glass of water, a spoon, and a folded cloth. She set it on the dresser, the same place the last tray had gone, then turned and looked at him the way someone looks at a clock that stopped, not with frustration, but with quiet expectation. She left something Addie said. Dale nodded once. She always does. She said it was up to you. He smiled without amusement. It usually is. Addie crossed the room and sat in the chair by the window, not waiting for permission. You planning to go? She asked. Eventually he said, not in a hurry. She said you'd know what the fifth letter meant. Dale didn't answer. He looked at the bag, then at Addie, then back to his hands. She writes like someone who wants to forget how it feels, he said, but can't help remembering anyway. That's not a bad kind of writing, Addie said. Depends on who reads it. And you? He asked. What do you read? Addie looked out the window. Not at anything in particular. Enough to know when not to ask more. They sat in silence for a while. The kind of silence that didn't need breaking. Downstairs, Rosie was rearranging jars on a shelf that didn't require rearranging, just as a way to keep busy. Outside, the street had resumed its midday shuffle boots on boards, wheels in dirt, the occasional cough from a passerby, too proud to admit it was dust and not sickness. Inside, the Finch remained as it always had, steady, dim, and full of things that didn't quite fit anywhere else. Do you know why she came? Dale asked finally. Addie stood, smoothed her apron, and picked up the empty tray. To see if you still carried something that mattered. And did I? That's for you to say. She turned to leave, paused at the door. Letters don't weigh much by themselves. It's the memory that makes them heavy. And then she was gone. Door clicking softly behind her. Dale stood, walked slowly to the bag, unzipped it, and pulled out the pouch again. He didn't open it, just held it, sat with it, like someone trying to remember if they were the sender or the recipient. In the saloon, Rosie placed a bowl of soup on the bar, added a napkin, and looked toward the stairs. You think he'll go today? She asked. Addie shook her head. Not yet. You think he'll open it again? I think he already has. Addie said, though she hadn't heard a thing. Not with his hands, just his face. The door creaked open again. This time, it wasn't wind or memory. It was a man neither of them recognized. Tall, wearing a coat too thin for the weather, with a look that suggested he was either chasing something or being chased by it. He stepped inside, removed his hat, and asked, "This the Finch?" Addie nodded. "It is. I'm supposed to meet someone. Name of Dale. Said he might be staying here." Rosie looked at Addie. Addie looked at the man. Then, without blinking, she said, Might be. You hungry? The man blinked, taken aback. A little, then sit down. You'll meet him soon enough. The man took a stool. Addie poured coffee. Upstairs, Dale stood once more, letter in hand, unread, but known. And the Finch braced itself for whatever might be said next, not loudly, not quickly, but inevitably. The man at the bar wore his tiredness like a second coat, not draped, but layered, pressed into his shoulders in a way that suggested he'd been walking longer than was wise, and thinking more than was helpful. He didn't ask for a name, just accepted the coffee Addie handed him with both hands, as if he feared it might vanish if he let go too soon. Rosie, from her usual post near the stove, studied him with the kind of gaze that didn't intrude, but memorized storing details like mismatched socks or the way his right boot tapped faintly out of sync with the left. You from around here? She asked after a few minutes, not because she cared, but because the question usually revealed more than the answer. The man smiled, just barely. Not really. Used to be. Not this town, but one like it. They're mostly like each other, Rosie said, stirring a pot that didn't need stirring. You said you're meeting someone, Addie said, without looking up from the ledger she wasn't writing in. You sure they're still expecting you? He said. If I ever came through to stop by the Finch. The man replied, sipping the coffee too fast, as if the heat might wake something up. Didn't promise much. Just said he might be here. That's a lot of maybe for 1 cup of coffee, Addie murmured. Dale doesn't make many promises, the man added, but he keeps the ones he means. Upstairs, Dale had moved from the bed to the chair by the window, the letter still in hand, still folded, still unopened. He didn't know who had arrived, not precisely, but the rhythm of voices below had changed, and his name had floated up the stairwell in a way that suggested his morning of avoidance had run out of corners. He opened the letter. Finally, the 5th one, the one she'd mentioned, the one he'd carried longest without looking. The paper was worn but whole, the ink steady, the words clear. It didn't start with dear or end with love. It just began as she always did. Mid-thought. You won't read this when you should. You'll wait like you always do, hoping the words will change with time. They won't. They never do. But I wrote them anyway, because some things deserve to be said, even if they're never heard. He read the rest without pausing, then folded it again, slower than before, and placed it on the table beside the pouch. Then he stood, pulled on his coat, and opened the door. The stairs greeted him, like old friends with bad knees creaking in all the right places. At the bottom, he paused, adjusting to the softer light, the scent of coffee and wood smoke curling around him like familiar regret. Addie didn't look up. Rosie didn't move. But the man at the bar turned slowly and stood setting down his cup with the care of someone unsure how soon it might be needed again. "You came," Dale said, voice flat, but not cold. The man nodded. "You said the Finch. Didn't think you'd remember." "I don't forget the places," the man replied. "Just the reasons." Dale approached, not hurried, not hesitant. They stood close, but not quite facing each other, like men who used to be close, in a way. Neither was ready to explain. Addie busied herself, wiping down the already clean bar. Rosie adjusted a lamp that didn't need adjusting. "You get my last letter?" Dale asked. "I got something," the man said. "Didn't know what to do with it." "You read it." "I tried." "Did it help?" "No." "Good," Dale said. "Wasn't meant to." They sat, finally, 2 stools apart, like boys who'd shared a punishment and couldn't quite forget who deserved it more. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, just wide, stretched out like a road. Neither had finished walking. "She came through," Addie said, then not loudly. "Left something for him." She didn't say who, but both men knew. Did she say why the man asked? "No," Addie said, but the note didn't need it. Dale reached into his coat, pulled out the 5th letter. Again, unfolded it, and placed it on the bar between them. The man didn't touch it, just stared. "She wrote it, like she knew I wouldn't get it until it was too late," Dale said. "Maybe that was the point. Maybe she wanted you to read it, late," the man said, "so it wouldn't be for you anymore." They fell silent again. The fire snapped once, not loudly. A cart rolled by outside wheels, groaning in the dust. Rosie set down a glass just a little too hard, the only sound in the room, besides breath and memory. So Dale said, finally, "You still running?" "Not lately." "That what brought you here?" "No," the man said. "I came because I didn't want to carry something I didn't understand anymore." "You still carrying it?" "I think I left it in the road," he said. "Might go back for it, though." Addie set 2 more cups on the bar, poured coffee, didn't ask if they wanted any. They drank it without question. The letter sat between them, unread again, but not forgotten. Upstairs, room 3 remained empty, the bed still warm. Outside, clouds gathered with no intention of raining. Inside the Finch waited like it always did, for something that might not happen yet, but always seemed just about to. By mid-afternoon, the saloon had settled into a hush, just 1 notch louder than silence. The kind of hush that doesn't hush so much as listen. The letter still lay on the bar between Dale and the man who hadn't given his name, slightly curled at the edges from being opened and folded too many times, not by anger or clumsiness, but by hesitation, the kind that crept in through the seams of things not quite said. Addie didn't clear the letter, didn't wipe around it, just worked the other end of the bar with the quiet presence of someone tending to a stove that wasn't lit but still warm. Rosie had taken to reorganizing the cups by size instead of usefulness, the surest sign that her mind was somewhere 2 blocks away and 3 years back. Neither of the men spoke for a while, which didn't surprise anyone. Words, when they came slow in the Finch, especially when the air held too many of them already. The unnamed man tapped the rim of his coffee cup, not nervously, but thoughtfully, like someone keeping time with a song they weren't willing to hum. Dale had gone still again, the kind of still that looked like rest, but was really just waiting for something to shift so he could decide whether to stand up or sit further down. It was the kind of posture only a certain kind of tired can bring, the kind that's not about sleep, but the long wait of trying not to say things you once promised you would. Addie watched this dance without dancing herself. She'd seen it before, though, perhaps not with these exact faces. Strangers who weren't quite strangers. Friends who weren't exactly friends. 2 people carrying pieces of the same story, but not the same memory of how it ended. "You gonna say your name?" Dale asked, eventually not looking up. The man smiled faintly, the kind of smile a person gives when they know it's a trap, but don't mind falling in. "Depends," he said. "You still using yours parts of it?" "Then call me Leo," the man said, and the name sat between them like a match that hadn't been struck. Rosie looked up at that, just slightly, the name familiar, but unconfirmed. Addie didn't move, but her fingers slowed on the cloth she was folding. "Leo Dale," said, as if testing the weight of it. "That's what she called you when she wanted something?" Leo replied. "When she was angry, it was something else." "I remember," Dale said, and the sentence didn't need a follow-up. The bar creaked under the weight of 2 cups and a memory neither of them had brought, but both had been carrying. Leo leaned back slightly, glancing around the room, like it might help him find a word he hadn't used in years. "She ever tell you what she meant by that 5th letter?" Dale shook his head. "She didn't need to." "But you read it. Just once." "That enough?" "No," Dale said too quickly. "But reading it again wouldn't help. She said the same to me," Leo muttered half to himself. Addie stepped away from the bar, then not suddenly just enough to suggest space was now part of the conversation. Rosie picked up a rag that didn't need lifting, and moved to the window, pretending to squint at the sky like weather was trying something bold. "What are we supposed to do now?" Leo asked genuinely. "We read the letters." "We came here. She's gone. There's no map." "Maybe that's the point," Dale said. "She wrote them, so we'd come, not so we'd know." "You think she's watching?" "I think she was always better at timing than us." Leo chuckled. "Yeah, she'd get us to the same room, just to prove she could." "And now what?" "Now we sit," Dale said, "until we figure out why that matters." They didn't move. The letter remained. The cups cooled. Outside, the sun dipped slightly lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the porch that leaned just a bit more every year. Inside, the Finch held its breath in the small ways, a squeak in the beam above the door, a shift in the floor near the third table, a sigh from the stove that hadn't been lit since morning. Rosie finally turned from the window. "You two gonna order something more substantial, or just stare each other down till the sun gives up?" "You got pie?" Leo asked, half smiling. "We might," Rosie replied, "if you're polite to it." "What kind?" "The kind that doesn't answer questions," Addie said, already reaching for the plates. "Just eat it." 2 slices appeared, one slightly larger than the other, but no one commented. Leo took the bigger one without ceremony. Dale nodded, as if that was how things had always gone. They ate in slow, deliberate bites, neither ravenous nor distracted, just filling a space that needed filling. Addie refilled the coffee. No one asked. The letter, now smudged at one corner from a brush of someone's sleeve, sat where it had always been, the center of something that no longer needed explaining. "So, what was it she wrote in yours?" Leo asked finally. "The 5th one." Dale took a breath, not deep, but real. "She said I'd wait too long to read it, and when I did, it wouldn't help. But she wrote it anyway, because some things deserve to be said, even if they're never heard." Leo stared down at his pie. "She said the same to me." "She probably did." Dale said, "She didn't write for just one person." Addie leaned her elbows on the bar, careful not to touch the letter. "She wrote for the space between you." And for once, neither man disagreed. The pie vanished without drama, which was how all good pie should go, quietly, gradually, with the soft clink of forks on ceramic, and the shared understanding that even pie eaten in silence says more than some conversations. Leo wiped his mouth with a napkin he'd folded twice before using a habit of someone raised with rules about manners and the kind of self-restraint that rarely sticks unless it's been earned the hard way. Dale pushed his plate away, by exactly 1 inch. Not enough to call attention, just enough to say it was finished. The letter remained on the bar between them, now more presence than paper. Its contents no longer private, but still personal, like an old tune both men knew the chords to, but hadn't agreed on a key. Rosie took the plates without a word, because nothing needed saying. She returned to the stove, not to cook, just to stand near something steady. The saloon held its shape, light slanting through the front windows, in long gold strips that painted the tables and the floor in quiet geometry. Addie didn't move much now. She stayed near the middle of the bar, wiping down a spot that hadn't been touched all day, the cloth moving more out of rhythm than necessity. It was in that moment, just as the silence had finally begun to feel companionable rather than expectant, that the front door opened. Not quickly, not slowly, just decisively. It didn't creak. It didn't slam. It simply moved aside, as if the person pushing it had opened it before and expected it to behave. A tall woman stepped through coat dark, with travel hair pinned but undone in places like she'd tried to be formal and changed her mind halfway. Her boots were covered in red clay, not from this town, but somewhere drier, somewhere where the wind pushed sideways more than it fell. She paused just inside the doorway, eyes adjusting not to the light, but to the room, the furniture, the air, the arrangement of people and objects, like she was checking a memory against reality and tallying the difference. No one moved, not yet. Addie's hands stilled on the cloth. Rosie set a kettle down that hadn't been boiling. Leo turned, but didn't rise. Dale didn't turn at all. Took longer than I meant to. The woman, said her voice, even like a stream that doesn't care where it ends. Dale exhaled slowly through his nose. Leo stood, then not abruptly, just enough to say he still knew how. "You're late," Leo said. "She always is." Dale murmured, eyes still forward. The woman smiled, not the kind of chela you give to greet, but the kind you give when you know your arrival has already changed the temperature of a room. "Trains run slower than letters," she said, "but I figured the pie would keep." Addie finally moved, poured a cup without asking, slid it across the bar to the space beside the letter. The woman sat on the stool where the larger slice of pie had been, placed her gloves neatly on the bar, and picked up the cup with hands that looked steady until you noticed her fingers tapped the handle twice before lifting. "You both read them?" she asked. "Some of them," Leo said. "Not all," Dale added. "That's fine," she said, blowing on the coffee. "I only meant for half of them to be understood anyway." "Which half?" Dale asked. The half that hurts less, she said, or the half that hurts just enough. Leo laughed quietly, like someone remembering a joke with too many rules. You always were better with words than with apologies. Words are easier, she said. They don't interrupt. The room here didn't shrink, but it did lean in. The bar, the chairs, even the piano in the corner seemed to hold their breath. Rosie returned to the front, arms crossed, but not closed off. Addie leaned against the shelf below the mirror, eyes never leaving the cup in the woman's hand. "You come to explain?" Dale asked. "I came because I didn't know what else to do," she said. "And I thought maybe this place would remember us better than we remember each other." "The Finch remembers," Addie said softly. "It just doesn't always tell." The woman nodded. "That's probably safer." Leo stepped forward, leaned on the bar. "You expect us to forgive you?" "I don't expect anything," she said, "but I did bring a letter for each of you. Just one, the last one. Not to read now, not even here." She reached into her coat, pulled 2 envelopes wrapped in thin parchment, placed them gently on the bar. One to Dale, one to Leo. Neither of them reached for theirs. Yet. "I thought letters were over," Dale said. "They are," she replied. "These are something else." What Leo asked. Answers. "No," she said. Exits. Outside, the wind had changed direction. Inside, the Finch adjusted its weight ever so slightly. The cups sat full again. The fire hummed low. And upstairs, room 3 sat ready but empty, a bed remade but not yet cold. The envelopes didn't move, and neither did the men they were meant for. They sat there on the bar, like invitations to a past that hadn't decided whether it wanted to be forgiven or forgotten. The woman didn't press, didn't explain, just sat quietly, with her coffee growing cold and her gloves folded like small promises beside the cup. Dale stared at his envelope without touching it, as if proximity might be enough to absorb the contents without the risk of actually reading them. Leo shifted his weight slightly, his hand drifting toward the letter, then away, like someone unsure whether they were allowed to finish a conversation they'd walked away from years ago. Addie poured fresh coffee into the woman's cup, then topped off Dale's and Leo's without asking, moving with a quiet familiarity that didn't intrude. Rosie leaned against the wall. Now, one foot crossed over the other, watching, not with suspicion, but with the weary attention of someone who's seen more reunions than resolutions, and knows the difference isn't always clear. You said these weren't letters, Dale said, finally, voice low even. You said they were exits. The woman nodded. Because they're not about me anymore, or what I meant. They're about what you do with what's left. You think we need directions? Leo asked. I think you need choices, she said, and a place to make them from. Dale looked over at her, then not sharply, just directly. Why now? Because the last thing I wrote was the last thing I had to say, she said. And once I mailed those, I realized I didn't want to wait and wonder whether you read them. I just wanted to see what happened when you did. Leo finally picked up his envelope. He didn't open it, just felt its weight in his hand, turned it once, twice, then set it back down in front of him. Feels the same as the others, he said. It isn't, she replied. It doesn't ask anything of you. Then why write it? Because something had to end, she said, even if we never figured out how we started. A clock somewhere in the saloon ticked loudly once. The fire crackled a single sharp pop, like punctuation in the stillness. Dale reached for his envelope too. His hand hovered, then settled. He slid it toward him, not close enough to open, but close enough to claim. Addie moved to the far end of the bar and began straightening the bottles on the back shelf. Each motion, deliberate, slow, unnecessary. Rosie uncrossed her arms, stepped toward the kitchen, then paused, waiting to see if this moment would finally release its tension or tie it tighter. You said you hoped for answers, Leo said. Did you find any? A few, the woman said, but they didn't fix anything. Then why share them? Dale asked. She looked at him, then at Leo. Because you were part of the question. Leo leaned on the bar, rested his elbows on the wood. And what if we don't read them? Then they're still exits, she said. You just won't know what door they open. And if we do, you get to decide if you walk through. Outside, a horse clopped lazily past the window, its rider humming a tune just out of key. Inside, the Finch returned to its breathless rhythm, a pause that had length but no tension, now just space waiting to be filled. Dale tapped the envelope once with his thumb, then tucked it into his coat pocket. Leo did the same. Neither man looked at the woman as they did it. She didn't look at them either. You staying? Addie asked, then her voice quiet but firm, like a floorboard choosing whether or not to groan. The woman shook her head. Not long, just passing through. Room 3's open, Addie said. No charge. Thank you, the woman said, and Addie nodded. Once the way people do when they're not saying goodbye, but not saying stay either. Rosie returned from the kitchen with a plate toast and jam. Nothing fancy. She set it in front of the woman, who blinked at it once, surprised, then picked up a piece and bit into it, like someone who hadn't realized they were hungry. Dale stood. So did Leo. Neither said a word. They turned, walked toward the stairs. At the top, Dale paused, glanced down at the bar, where the woman now sat, eating slowly, eyes on her plate. He didn't speak. He just turned again and disappeared into the hall. Leo followed. The creak of the stairs echoed once, then faded. Addie leaned on the bar, arms folded. "That everything?" she asked. The woman looked up, toast paused halfway to her mouth. "For now," she said. "But the exits only work if you know when to leave." "And you?" Rosie asked. "You know when." The woman smiled just barely. "I'm getting closer." The stairs spoke first. A creak, then another, not hurried, but not idle, either, just enough to draw Addie's glance from behind the bar and Rosie's head from her half-hearted crossword in the corner. It wasn't unusual for someone to come back down the stairs. It happened often enough, usually with a complaint about the mattress, or a request for more blankets, or a polite cough, meant to precede something less polite. But this sound, this particular return, carried a rhythm that had nothing to do with discomfort, and everything to do with uncertainty. Dale emerged first letter still in his coat pocket, face unreadable, but eyes clearer than they'd been all morning. He walked to the same stool he'd left placed, both hands on the bar, then turned just slightly as Leo followed behind him, slower, as though the descent carried more weight than the climb. The woman hadn't moved from her seat, though the toast was now gone, and the coffee had cooled again, untouched, after the first sip. She looked up, but didn't smile. Her expression, the soft kind of neutral that people wear when they know they've asked too much already. Dale reached into his pocket, withdrew the envelope, and laid it flat on the bar. Leo did the same. Neither moved to open theirs yet. "We changed our minds," Dale said, as if the sentence explained everything. "We'll read them here," Leo added. "Not all of it out loud," Dale said quickly. "Just enough." The woman nodded, accepting. "That's fair." Addie poured 2 more cups of coffee and set them down without a word. Rosie closed her crossword and stood, one eyebrow raised, but said nothing. Dale picked at the edge of the envelope, lifting the flap slowly, almost reverently. He slid out the folded page, unfolded it once, then twice. His eyes scanned the top, paused, then continued. He didn't speak for several seconds, just stared at the words like they might arrange themselves differently if he blinked enough. When he did speak, It was quiet, low. She wrote that the reason I never finished anything was because I was always afraid it wouldn't be good enough. That the silence I left in every room was louder than any words I could have said. He looked up, voice flat. She said she understood, but that it still hurt. Leo looked down at his own letter, but didn't open it yet. She told me I was always chasing moments instead of people, that I mistook movement for meaning, and that maybe if I stopped running long enough, I'd notice who was still standing beside me. Dale smirked slightly, but it didn't reach his eyes. Did she tell you to forgive yourself too? No, Leo said. She said if I waited for forgiveness, I'd miss the point. Dale folded the letter slowly, precisely, and placed it back in the envelope. She didn't expect us to change, he said. She just didn't want us to forget why we didn't. The woman hadn't touched her cup. Her eyes had dropped to her gloves, again, folded still, the way people fold things they know they won't wear again, but can't throw away. I wasn't sure you'd read them, she said. I wasn't sure I'd even get them into your hands. You did, Dale said. And now what? She asked. Now we go back upstairs, Leo said, and maybe finish a conversation without walking away from it this time. Dale nodded, and the two men stood again, slower this time, not in a rush, not dragging. As they turned, Addie said, "Letters don't usually fix people." Dale looked back. They don't need to. Sometimes they just remind you you're not the only one who broke something. Upstairs, room 3 remained unoccupied, the door ajar, bed still made. Dale and Leo returned to room 5, instead the one they'd been given to share after Addie noticed the way their names danced around the same sentence without ever meeting. The woman stayed at the bar alone again, but the silence had changed its flavor. Rosie brought her a fresh cup, steaming. "You think they'll be all right?" Rosie asked. "Probably not," the woman said. "But maybe they'll stop pretending they are." Addie leaned on the bar, watching the ceiling, like it might offer a weather report for emotions. "People don't need to be fixed," she said. "They just need to stop bleeding on each other." The woman finally picked up the cup, drank. It wasn't hot anymore, but it was enough. The Finch exhaled its walls, relaxing into the late afternoon hum, and outside the wind paused just long enough for a bird to land on the porch rail and stay there uncertain. But still, the Finch was used to strange arrivals. A coat with no owner slung across a chair for 3 days before someone claimed it. A letter slid under the door with no return address and only the words, "For when you're ready," scrawled across the front. A dog that wandered in during a snowstorm, curled up by the hearth and left 3 weeks later without ever barking. But the box that arrived that afternoon came with no explanation and no sound placed carefully on the corner of the bar by a courier. No one saw enter, and no one remembered leaving. Addie found it first just after Rosie disappeared into the back to refill the jar of pepper flakes that hadn't been touched since last winter. It wasn't large, about the size of a bread loaf, wrapped in brown paper. The edges sharp, the tape clean, the string tied in a knot too neat for any ordinary hand. No name, no address, no markings, except a faint smudge in the shape of a thumbprint on one corner, as if someone had hesitated before letting it go. Addie didn't touch it right away. She stood there a long moment, head tilted slightly, the way you might look at a memory that shows up out of order. Then she called gently over her shoulder, "Rosie? You expecting something?" Rosie's voice came from the kitchen, muffled. "Only if it smells like garlic and comes in a jar." "Then this ain't it." Rosie returned, drying her hands on a dish towel. She saw the box, frowned. "That wasn't there earlier." "I know." "It knock." "Not that I heard." Rosie approached, stood beside Addie, and they both stared at it, like the box might declare its intentions if given enough silence. Upstairs, Dale and Leo remained out of sight, though footsteps could be heard now and then, soft, uncertain, the way people move when they're deciding whether to leave or stay. The woman at the bar had turned slightly in her seat, watching with quiet interest, but said nothing. Addie finally reached forward, slid the box an inch closer, just enough to hear the slight scrape against the wood. She untied the string with slow fingers, folded it neatly beside the parcel, then peeled the paper back in sections, careful not to tear it. The box beneath was plain wood, nailed at the edges, unmarked. No hinges. Just a lid fitted snug, like it hadn't been opened in some time. She lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a square of faded green fabric, was a book. Not a new one. Not quite old, either. The cover worn but intact, the spine bearing no title, just a faint crease from years of being bent backward. Addie lifted it out, turned it in her hands. No inscription, no bookmark, no hint of ownership. She opened it to the first page. Blank. She turned to the next. Also blank. Page after page, dozens, clean, unmarked, untouched. "It's empty," she said aloud. Rosie leaned closer. "Maybe it's a journal." "Maybe," Addie murmured, closing it again. "But who sends a blank book with no name?" The woman stood now, slowly, hands resting lightly on the bar. "May I see it?" Addie handed it over. The woman turned it, opened it, flipped through the pages. Her brow furrowed slightly. "Feels familiar," she said. "Like something I lost and forgot I missed." "You think it's meant for you?" Addie asked. "I don't know," the woman replied. "But it doesn't feel like it's not." Rosie crossed her arms. "Maybe it's not a message. Maybe it's a mirror." The woman smiled faintly. "That's the worst kind." Upstairs, footsteps descended again. Dale, first Leo, just behind. They both looked different, lighter, maybe, or just less guarded, like men who'd unpacked something without breaking it. They paused when they saw the box, the book, the three women standing around it, like a secret trying to remember how to tell itself. "What's that?" Dale asked. "Delivery," Addie said. "No sender." "What's in it?" "Nothing. Looks like something Leo said," eyeing the book. The woman held it up. "It's blank." "Still something Dale said." Leo moved closer, peered over her shoulder. "Might be worth keeping." "Why?" she asked. "So someone else can fill it," he said. She looked down at the pages again, ran her hand over the paper, then nodded once and closed it. "Then I'll hold on to it," she said, "until it needs to be passed along." Dale stepped to the bar, retrieved the coffee he hadn't finished earlier. He sipped it, winced, slightly cold now, but didn't complain. Leo joined him quiet again. The woman sat once more, the book now beside her gloves. The Finch seemed to exhale once more, like a bellows that had been waiting to cool. Addie moved the box to the end of the bar, set it upright on its side, and leaned the lid against it, like a door half shut. "No return address," she murmured again. "Doesn't mean it didn't come from somewhere," Rosie said. The clock on the wall ticked forward. Outside, the sun began its slow descent behind the ridge, throwing long shadows across the porch, shadows that stretched into the room and curled around the legs of chairs, like stray cats looking for a place to stay. Evening had begun. Its slow stretch across the saloon, long fingers of light slipping through the windows and painting everything in shades of almost gold. The shadows settled like house guests who knew not to ask for too much. And the warmth in the room deepened not just from the fire which Rosie had stoked without fuss, but from something more subtle. A sense of something shared, if not quite resolved. The woman still sat with the blank book resting beside her gloves, the corners of its cover now slightly smudged from hands that couldn't help exploring what they didn't yet understand. Dale and Leo had moved to a table near the back. Their coffee cups refilled their voices, low too soft to carry, but firm enough to confirm they were still untangling whatever it was they'd begun upstairs. Addie behind the bar had resumed her quiet tending, lining up the glasses, wiping down the register, refolding the cloth she never quite put away. Rosie stood by the stove, pretending to read an old almanac while really listening to the room breathe. The woman ran her fingers along the book's spine, then opened it again. Not to the first page this time, but somewhere near the middle, as if expecting something to have changed in the blankness since the last look. Of course it hadn't. Not yet. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a pencil, short-sharpened, many times, the kind of pencil carried by someone who preferred writing to talking. She looked at the page, then looked up. "Does it matter what I write?" she asked no one in particular. Addie looked over, one eyebrow raised. "Only if you plan to read it again." Rosie didn't look up. "Or if you don't want someone else to." "What if it's just for now?" the woman asked. "Then it'll last exactly as long as you need it to," Addie said. The woman nodded, lowered the pencil, and wrote one word. It wasn't a name. Not exactly. But it looked like one, the kind of name someone might have used once, but hadn't said aloud in a long time. She stared at it after she wrote it, as if it might vanish or correct itself. It didn't. She turned the page, wrote another. This one longer. A sentence, maybe two. Nothing fancy. No punctuation yet. Just thought set down in graphite. She flipped another page, and another. The book remained silent, but something in the room shifted. Dale looked over from his table, eyes, briefly landing on the open book, then back to his cup. Leo followed his gaze, then leaned closer and said something that made Dale snort just a little. Not quite a laugh, but near enough. "What did you write?" Rosie asked, finally, setting the almanac aside. The woman looked up. "Just a reminder. To yourself? To anyone who opens it next." Addie approached, slowly, wiped an invisible smear from the bar. "You think someone will?" "Eventually," the woman said. "Things like this don't stay still forever. They do. In the Finch." Rosie muttered, but there wasn't any venom in it. The woman closed the book, gently patted the cover, once like a thank you, and slid it closer to the edge of the bar. "Then maybe I'll leave it here. We don't usually keep other people's books," Addie said. "It's not mine," the woman replied. "Not anymore." Addie looked at her a moment longer, then nodded. "It'll stay safe." The woman stood, gathering her gloves, placing them in her coat pocket. She didn't reach for the book again. She looked at Dale and Leo, still seated, still talking now, with the faint echo of something like agreement in their posture. She turned to Addie. "Thank you," she said. Addie tilted her head. "You sure you're done here?" "No," the woman said, "but I'm done enough to leave something behind." Rosie gave a soft sound, like a laugh smothered in a sigh. "That's one way to put it." The woman smiled, not broadly, just enough to soften the corners of her face. "You'll tell them I left it." "They'll know," Addie said. The woman stepped toward the door, her boots quiet on the worn floorboards. Just before she reached it, she paused, glanced back, and opened her mouth like she might say something else, something heavier, something older. Her lips formed the beginning of a name. Tell? But the rest never came. She closed her mouth again, offered a small shrug, and pushed open the door. The bell above it didn't ring. It never did when someone left the right way. Outside, the evening had cooled. The wind was low and steady, the kind that didn't push, just moved gently through the space left behind. Inside, Addie picked up the book, opened it to the page with the single name, read it once, then closed it again. "I think we'll keep this one on the shelf," she said. Rosie nodded, retrieving a small cloth to dust the corner near the old ledger. "Might want to give it a label." "Already has one," Addie said, "just not for us to read." The book sat untouched for 3 days, and a little more nestled between a cracked copy of the town ledger from 1893 and an old recipe book with half the pages missing and the rest smelling faintly of cinnamon and something that had never quite settled. Addie had placed it there without ceremony, spine out, no label, no explanation, just another quiet object on a shelf already full of other people's pauses. Most patrons didn't notice it. Some glanced past it while reaching for matches or trying to remember what the difference was between peppered biscuits and spiced ones. But one morning, just after sunrise, and just before the first coffee was poured, a boy not quite tall enough to see the bar without leaning climbed onto the lowest stool and stretched his fingers toward the shelf. He wasn't a regular. He had wandered in while his father hitched a wagon out front, the kind of arrival that didn't disturb so much as appear. Addie saw him, but said nothing. Rosie, sweeping near the door, raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. The boy's fingers brushed the spine of the blank book, hesitated, then pulled it free. It opened easily, no resistance, falling naturally to the page with the single word, the not quite name, written in soft pencil. He looked at it for a long moment, lips silently shaping the letters as though tasting them. Then, without flipping the page, he turned to Addie and asked in the kind of voice that only children and very old people seem to manage, without effort, "Who's this?" Addie dried her hands on her apron and walked over. She didn't look at the page right away. She looked at the boy, his steady grip on the book, the curious tilt of his head. Then she glanced down. "It's someone who used to stop by," she said. "Not often. But when they did, things tended to shift a little." "Is it their book?" "Not exactly. They left it here." Why, the boy asked. Addie thought for a moment, so someone else could figure out what to do with it. He nodded solemnly, like that made perfect sense. He turned the page. Read the next line, then the next, then stopped. "These aren't stories," he said. "Not yet." Addie agreed. He read another few lines, but they sound like they're trying to become one. Rosie leaned on the broom, now watching. Maybe that's what it's for. Not a book. A beginning. "Can I write something?" the boy asked, eyes wide. "If you want to," Addie said. "But only if it's something you mean." He nodded again, serious as a ledger, and took the pencil Addie offered from behind the register. He found a blank page. Many were still waiting, and wrote slowly, carefully, each letter shaped like he was building a tiny house. When he was done, he didn't say the words aloud. He just handed the book back to Addie and climbed down. "You want me to keep that in there?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "But don't tell anyone which page it is." "I wouldn't dare." He ran to the door, then called something to his father outside, and disappeared as suddenly as he'd come. Addie returned the book to the shelf, exactly where it had been. But this time, she slid it just a little deeper between the others, as if to say, "This one's got a heartbeat now." Rosie crossed to the bar, leaned close. "What did he write?" Addie shook her head. "Didn't read it." "You will." Maybe Addie said, "When it feels like it's for me." Upstairs, the morning creaked to life with footsteps and quiet water pipes. Dale appeared first, hair slightly mussed, eyes still in the process of waking. He nodded at Rosie, accepted the cup of coffee. Addie slid toward him and took his usual seat by the window, watching the street like it might remember something. Leo came down next, slower, with a book of his own tucked under his arm, something dog-eared and brittle, not worth money, but full of small ideas. He nodded toward the shelf. "That new sort of," Addie replied. "Found it, or it found us." He walked over, traced the spines with a finger, stopped just short of the blank one. "Looks familiar." "It should," Addie said. "Someone like you left it behind." "Someone like me?" Someone trying to finish something without ending it. He chuckled low and easy and didn't ask more. Instead, he returned to his seat beside Dale, and the two resumed their morning ritual of saying nothing for a long time until it felt like enough had been said. Outside, the wagon pulled away, leaving behind 2 faint tracks in the dust that would vanish by noon. Inside, the finch listened to its new words, resting quietly between older stories and recipes that never got made quite the same way twice. The air that morning carried the soft hush of dust freshly settled, like the town had taken a long exhale overnight and wasn't in a rush to breathe in again. The finch felt quieter than usual, not from emptiness, but from a kind of waiting, the kind that leans against door frames and glances at clocks it doesn't trust. The book still sat tucked between its taller neighbors on the shelf, now bearing 3 sets of fingerprints and the faintest impression of graphite where the boy had pressed a little too hard on the page he refused to name. Addie had walked past it twice already, each time slowing just a little, as if the book might call out if she listened closely enough. Rosie had dusted around it pointedly, not opening it, though she had narrowed her eyes at the binding, and muttered something about handwriting that sounded like it came from a person who spelled tomorrow with too many R's. Dale and Leo sat at their usual spot by the window, sipping coffee that had gone lukewarm without complaint, watching a stray cat contemplate the edge of the porch like it was a philosophical decision. It was just after the hour when most travelers arrived, and just before the hour when most locals remembered they had errands they didn't want to run, when the door opened with a kind of familiarity that didn't need an announcement. A man stepped in older than the door remembered, younger than the floor, expected wearing a jacket too thin for the season, and carrying a bag that looked like it hadn't been fully unpacked in years. His hat was worn, but not tattered, his boots clean, but tired, and his eyes moved over the room like someone checking for exits and finding instead old stories left mid-sentence. Addie looked up from the register. "Morning." The man nodded. "Didn't think it'd still be here. Most things don't leave unless they're asked to." Addie replied. He stepped forward, approached the bar, glanced once at the shelf where the book rested, then back at Addie. "Is it still open?" "Depends what you mean by it," she said. "The room, the chair, the book." He smiled faintly, a line of amusement that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I meant the place. But the book, too. You know it." "I left the first page," he said. Rosie emerged from the back, arms folded. "So you're the name." He turned to her, raised one brow. "Which name?" "The one we couldn't quite say out loud," she said. "It was half-written and left on the bar, like an apology that didn't finish arriving." He nodded, slowly, moved toward the shelf, ran his fingers across the spines until he found the one with no title. He pulled it free, opened it to the page he'd written all that time ago. His eyes scanned the word, the sentence, the one that looked like a name, but wasn't yet. Then he turned a few pages, read the boy's contribution, smiled a little wider this time. It's fuller than I expected. People tend to keep adding, Addie said, even when they're not sure why. He turned to a blank page near the back, but not the end, and drew the pencil from the spine of the ledger someone had left too close to the edge. He didn't write in the center. He wrote in the margin sideways, with the curve of someone who didn't like drawing attention. Rosie watched from across the bar, arms still crossed. You gonna tell us what it says? No, he said gently, closing the book. But I'll say the name, if that helps. Addie nodded. Names help. He looked at her, then at Dale and Leo, who were watching now without trying to hide it. He cleared his throat. Her name was Marion. The silence that followed didn't fall. It settled like a coat placed gently on a chair, familiar and expected. Addie nodded once. Thank you. Did she come back through? He asked. Briefly. Did she leave anything? A little, Addie said. But most of it wasn't hers anymore. He held the book to his chest for a moment, then placed it gently back on the shelf a few inches farther right than before. I don't need to carry it anymore. You sure? Rosie asked. No, he said, but I think it belongs here now. The door opened again this time, letting in a cooler breeze and the scent of rain still thinking about falling. The man adjusted his coat, turned toward the door. You staying? Addie asked. Not today, he said, but I might pass back through. We'll keep the book warm, Rosie said. Just don't expect it to wait forever. Books don't wait, he replied. They remember. And with that, he stepped outside. Boots quiet on the porch, hat pulled low against a wind that had finally made up its mind. The wind that followed him out lingered a little too long, brushing through the room, like it had somewhere else to be, but wasn't in a rush. The door eased closed without drama, its frame settling back into place, as if to say, that wasn't goodbye, just an in-between. The book sat quietly again, slightly more tilted on the shelf than before, its spine bearing the faintest indentation from being held too long by fingers that weren't quite ready to let go. No one touched it that day. Not Addie, though her hand drifted toward it twice while dusting. Not Rosie, even when she leaned a little too close while adjusting the crooked picture above the shelf. Not even Dale, who gave it a long sideways glance while passing, but kept walking without pausing. It waited, not like a book, but like a moment that hasn't yet figured out if it should repeat itself. The hours drifted gently, the saloon filling with the usual blend of local silence and occasional questions disguised as orders. A man asked for the usual, which turned out to be something no one remembered him ever ordering before. A woman came in to return a scarf she claimed wasn't hers, even though Addie was fairly certain it had been. At some point, Rosie fixed the squeak in the second stool by stuffing a sliver of cedar beneath the leg, muttering that some noises only stop when ignored. Then, sometime just before the lamp over the back table flickered once. Without reason, the book slid from the shelf. It didn't fall exactly. It leaned tipped and slipped in one fluid motion, landing not with a thud, but with a soft, papery sigh, as though it had grown tired of waiting and wanted a change in perspective. It landed open, face down, near the foot of the bar. Addie saw it. First paused, with a bottle in one hand, then knelt to retrieve it. She didn't close it right away. The page it had landed on was blank, except for a single line written sideways, near the center, in unfamiliar script pencil, faint and slightly smudged. No signature, no punctuation. Just a question, or something shaped like one. She read it once, then again. Then she turned the book around and placed it carefully on the bar, open to the same page. Rosie leaned in to read lips forming the words silently. Dale looked up from his usual seat. Leo joined him without asking. The line read, "What stays when nothing is left?" It didn't ask for an answer. It didn't even wait for one. It just sat there, breathing softly against the wood. Addie folded her arms. "Well," she said, "that's either philosophy or a shopping list." "Depends on the day," Rosie replied. "Or the person," Dale added. Leo tapped a finger against the bar. "It doesn't say who wrote it. Doesn't need to," Addie said. "Some questions belong to all of us." She didn't close the book. No one did. It stayed open for the rest of the day. People passing by and glancing at the page, some stopping, some nodding, some frowning, slightly, as though it reminded them of something they couldn't quite place. Just before closing, a young woman came in a traveler, by the look of her boots, with the wrong dust for the region eyes scanning the corners, like she expected a piano to start playing itself. She didn't order anything, just stood near the bar, read the question, and without speaking, flipped to the next page. She took the pencil from the register and wrote something, not on the lines, but just beneath the question, small and slanted, almost like a correction, but not quite. Then she placed the pencil down, nodded at Addie, and left. Addie waited until she was gone, then leaned over and read the new line. It said, "The story." She left it there, closed the book slowly, like a door not meant to be shut all the way, and returned it to the shelf. This time, it leaned slightly to the left, just enough to be noticed, and just enough to remind anyone looking that it wasn't finished yet. The book didn't move overnight, which might have surprised some folks who had seen it do exactly that the day before. But the Finch wasn't in the business of repeating performances. Its magic, or whatever passed for magic, in a place made of wood, old brass hinges, and quiet choices, had a sense of timing, not spectacle. Morning arrived with its usual hush, a sleepy sunbeam slicing across the bar, landing right on the spine of the nameless book. Addie noticed it from the kitchen and gave a small nod, like she was agreeing with something the day had said before fully opening its mouth. Rosie arrived late, but only by 5 minutes, the kind of late that doesn't need apology and usually comes with a muffin wrapped in someone else's napkin. Dale and Leo had taken to walking before breakfast lately, returning with their cheeks red from the wind and their coats smelling faintly of pine, as if the trees had leaned in to remind them that time moved, even when you didn't. The book stayed on the shelf for most of the morning until a stranger, not the usual kind, not the dusty or the hurried, but a man in a gray coat with elbows that had seen too many winters, walked in through the back. Not the main door, not the porch, but the door near the pantry, the one no one really used, except for deliveries, and the cat that didn't belong to anyone. He didn't speak. He didn't pause. He just walked in like he knew where everything was, like the Finch wasn't a building, but a memory he'd been walking through for years. Addie noticed him only when he stopped at the shelf and pulled the book free without hesitation. She opened her mouth to say something, what she wasn't sure, but Rosie caught her eye and shook her head just once. Let it be. The man took the book to the table nearest the fireplace, which had not been lit, but still gave off the feeling of having been recently warm. He placed the book down, opened it to the very beginning, and started to read. No coffee, no conversation. Just page after page turned with the rhythm of someone familiar with long silences and the weight they carried. An hour passed, then 2. Nobody disturbed him. Customers came and went. Rosie offered him pie once without speaking. He didn't look up, but a tiny shake of his head was enough. Addie kept refilling the coffee pot, even though he never asked for any. Dale and Leo returned and sat across the room, exchanging glances like men who weren't sure whether they recognized him or just recognized something about him. By midday, he was more than halfway through. The book didn't resist his pace. It didn't flutter or twitch. It let him move through it, like it had been waiting for this particular reader, not because he would finish it, but because he might understand it backward. That's what Rosie said later over stew and bread. "He's reading it the wrong way round," she murmured. "Or maybe the right way, if you believe stories end before they start." Addie just nodded. She was watching his hands now, how they rested on the page after each turn, fingers spread slightly, like pressing the words into place. By late afternoon, he reached the last written page, the one with the sideways question and the scribbled reply underneath. He stared at it a long time. Then he turned to the blank page beyond it. Then the next, and the next, until he reached a page near the very end where only the grain of the paper lived. He pulled a pen from his coat pocket. Not a pencil. Not the stub that lived behind the register. A pen with ink as dark as river mud, and a tip worn just enough to speak softly. And he wrote. One long sentence stretching across the top of the page, each letter careful but not slow, like someone had memorized this line long ago and only now found the space to let it out. Addie didn't try to read it. Neither did Rosie. Dale watched from the side, but didn't move closer. Leo tilted his head, narrowed his eyes, but stayed in his chair. When the man finished writing, he closed the book with both hands, pressed his palms to the cover, and sat still for a moment longer. Then he stood, walked back to the shelf, slid the book into place precisely where it had lived before, and walked out the same way he came through the back door, which creaked once and then clicked shut with the soft finality of a thought that didn't need speaking aloud. Nobody followed. Nobody asked who he was. But when Addie finally approached the shelf, she saw that the book leaned differently now, not like it had been read, like it had been remembered. She touched the spine, then left it alone. Some stories don't need retelling, just returning. Evening crept into the Finch without fuss, the kind that doesn't draw curtains or light lamps until absolutely necessary. Outside, the sky folded gently into itself, clouds unraveling into long streaks of near blue, near purple, not quite either. The kind of sky that suggests endings, but doesn't insist on them. Inside the book remained on the shelf unmoved since the man in the gray coat had returned it with such deliberate ease. It leaned neither left nor right now, standing almost upright, the spine still without title, but somehow firmer than before. Addie hadn't touched it, not since watching it go back into place. Rosie, too, had kept a respectful distance, though more out of curiosity than reverence, like she was waiting to see what it might do next, and didn't want to rush it into something unremarkable. Dale and Leo had left earlier than usual, saying something vague about a letter that needed replying and a road that didn't drive itself. They'd taken a flask and a folded piece of paper with them, and Addie suspected neither would return in quite the same shape. It was nearly closing time. Rosie had already flipped the sign, even though it rarely mattered. The Finch didn't operate by strict hours, only by feel, and tonight it felt like the walls were leaning in for a long exhale. Addie stood behind the bar, wiping a glass that hadn't been used since Tuesday. Rosie dried her hands and looked toward the shelf. "Do you think it's finished?" she asked. "Books aren't," Addie said. "People just stop writing. Maybe it ran out of room. There's always another page." Rosie nodded and wandered toward the fire, which hadn't been lit, but still gave the illusion of warmth. And then, without a sound, the book shifted. No one touched it. No draft moved through. No vibration passed underfoot. It simply tilted forward, not in a fall, but in a motion so smooth it felt like the shelf had offered a hand. It dropped forward an inch, then landed closed gently, quietly, as if tucking itself in. Addie blinked, set down the glass. Rosie turned. "Did it just—" "Yes," Addie said. She walked over, picked it up, held it for a moment in both hands. It felt warmer than it should have, as if recently held, though no one had touched it. She opened it, just to the last page, just to read the final line, the one the man in the gray coat had written in ink that still shone slightly under the lamplight. It said, "If you've made it this far, the rest is yours to tell." Addie stared at it, then closed the book slowly. Rosie approached, peered at the cover, still blank. "What now?" "Now it rests," Addie said. She placed the book under the bar this time. Not hidden, just grounded, like something that didn't need to be seen for a while. The Finch creaked once, not loud, just the kind of noise old buildings make when they recognize their own breath. And from somewhere, maybe the rafters, maybe the memory of footsteps, maybe the bar itself, a voice hummed. Just a note, low, warm, without language. It didn't speak. It didn't say. It remembered. Addie smiled faintly. Rosie did too. The voice faded. The lamps dimmed. The sky outside held on to the last light longer than expected. And just before Addie turned out the final lamp, something very small happened. Not loud, not bright, just the first line of something else. But for now, it was enough that it hadn't been written yet.